Good evening and welcome to Lockdown Learning. My name is Bren Carlu and I'm the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. Now, most people watching this will have been to Israel. Many of us have lived in Israel or have friends and family who do. I think it is safe to say that we all, regardless, were we Israeli, if we voted for Meretz or Yamina, Likud or Blue or White, we would all have roughly the same vision in mind when it comes to Israel. We want an Israel that is safe and that is at peace with itself and in time will be at peace with its neighbors. News from Israel over the past few weeks and months have been worrying, to say the least. The COVID-19 pandemic, which we all thought was contained in Israel, has unleashed a vicious second wave, and now ongoing protests are rocking Israel. Protesters are targeting the Prime Minister, his legal woes and his handling of the pandemic. And counter-protesters are protesting the protesters. They've physically attacked them, plus journalists. There have even been some racial attacks. Now, this is not the Israel that many of us, or all of us, were hoping to see on our social media and news feeds. So tonight, to discuss all of this, we have Dr. Eilon Schwartz. Now, he is the director of the Shaharit Institute. Now, Shaharit strives to bridge the divides of Israeli society that threaten its shared future. That is, the divides between secular, religious, and the Haredim, between Jews and Arabs, and between the haves and the have-nots, and of course, between the political left, the center, and the right. The Institute combines forward-thinking ideas and policy work, multicultural leadership, and local community training that brings diverse people together in collective action. This is good stuff, and I'm really looking forward to talking with him tonight. Talking with him will be Sharene Hambur, who is the president of Zionism Victoria. Just before I hand you over to Sharene, just a heads up that next week we have Einat Wilf with us. She will be speaking about all sorts of things, including, of course, her most recent book about the War of Return. But that's next week. In the meantime, I'll hand you over to Sharene for tonight's Lockdown Learning.
Thank you, Bren. And welcome to everyone, in particular to Dr. Eilon Schwartz, who's our special guest this evening. Elon, as Bren mentioned, you're currently the director of the Shaharit Institute, but I noticed from having a look at your CV that you previously held a position as the founding director of the Herschel Centre for Environmental Learning and Leadership. So I gather that environmental matters are very much ones that are of concern to you. And I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the journey from there to your current position and what the Shaharit Institute does on the ground, and I suppose especially at this time when we see Israel so torn in many directions.
So first of all, good evening to all of you. It's afternoon here. It's 1 in the afternoon here in Israel. And it's a pleasure to be here. So thanks for the invitation. I worked for many years as the founding director of something called the Heschel Center, named after Abraham Joshua Heschel, a Jewish theologian that dealt with a lot with questions of nature, the natural world, spirituality, and social action. I did that for close to 15, 20 years. I was on the board of the Jewish National Fund. I was the head of the umbrella organization Life and Environment here in Israel, of over 100 environmental and social organizations. And so a lot of my friends in the environmental world we're curious what happened. How did I, move from that to essentially something that looks ostensibly different? And I think my explanation of why that happened, there are a lot of reasons, but for the discussion this evening, I think it's pertinent to our general conversation. I think one of the things that drove me about the environment is that intuitively, I don't know if I could have articulated it at the time, was that it was a meeting point between different groups of people. Right? The environment is shared by all of us, for religious, for ultra-religious, for secular, for right-wing, for left-wing, for Mizrahim, for Ashkenazim, for Jews and Arabs. We all share this land, this landscape. Pollution is shared, right? Environmental goods are shared. And so it was a place that talked about not what would divided us, but rather what brought us together. And as the years went by, I became more and more cognizant and more sensitive to the fact that when I looked in the room of environmentalists, in spite of the fact that it had the promise of bringing all these different groups together, I looked in the room and I saw that essentially, who was in the room was a very specific sociology, a very specific group of people. Secular largely, upper middle class largely, well-educated largely, geographically located in the greater Tel Aviv area, a couple of neighborhoods of Jerusalem, newspaper reading primarily Haaretz, and politically affiliated with the center to the left and even to the far left. And it started to weigh on me. What is going on here? Why is it that environmentalism that is supposed to bridge is just another one of the wedge issues, another one of the places where it doesn't reach over, but it connects to just a very particular sociology? And what I came to is some conclusion that the problem is both the messenger, which is easier to understand, that it's caught in this group, on this sociology. And so we need people engaged from a lot of different places. That's the easier part, difficult to do, multicultural staff, multicultural voices, multicultural conversation. But the more difficult conclusion was the problem was not just the messenger. The problem was the message. The message was steeped within a very particular sociology's assumptions, and that other worlds of meaning, other groups in Israeli society, other groups in the world, this is not just an Israeli problem, other groups in the world see all of these issues very differently. Questions of peace are stuck in a very specific sociology, the same sociology that the environmentalists are stuck in, right? A very particular one. If you want to expand, you have to ask serious questions about how the world looks from other perspectives and believe that those other perspectives have value, and to cross those divides, to think differently about all the issues that confront us as a society. And so that was what led to the founding of the Shaharit Institute. A long-winded answer, perhaps, to your relatively simple question.
I think it gives us a context for how you are and what you're doing now. I mean, in particular, what does the Shaharit Institute do? I know Bren mentioned community training and trying to bring people together, but in really, as we would say, tachlis terms, what does the Institute do?
Yeah, so there are three fields of activity that we do, right? The goal being to build a society that has a kind of a backbone that holds people together and doesn't drive people apart, including our politics that can bring people together and drive people apart. So we do classic think tank stuff. However, the think tank stuff we do is we have a team of fellows. So we have an ultra-Orthodox and Arab, a religious Zionist, a settler, a leftist lawyer, all in the same room together. And they talk about pertinent issues that are confronting Israel, from the nation state law to questions of the courts, to questions of the relations of religion and state. And they produce a large series of documents around those things and trying to frame or reframe the political debate in different places. We have leadership programs, because we believe that we need to have a leadership that holds on to this connections between these different groups. So we have a leadership program called 120 that have every year in each cohort representatives from 9 different political parties, but with deep affections one to the other, right? What was once called fraternity in the French Revolution, but we would call, right, empathy for one another with real affections. Not that they agree on everything, but people change and people hear each other. And there's an empathy that even if we disagree, that disagreement is one of value and not one that simply demonizes the other side. So we do those kind of leadership programs in religious Zionism and ultra-Orthodox. We're launching an Arab leadership program that always is looking to how you connect those different people. We have members of Knesset today that are graduates for a 120 program from different sides of the divide that work together. And then we do community organizing in the field. We try to show how citizens in a town, let's say Ashdod, where there are Haredim and where there are strong Mizrahim and a new French population that has come in and a Russian population from the massive immigrations of the 90s, how they can come together and start working together, not just talking, but actually changing real things in the town that work for everyone, and to show that we can build a politics that people come together and not just divide. And so we do this work in about 20 different parts of Israeli society today, 20 different towns from the north to the south, showing that that's possible, and also nurturing a politics that embraces that, what we call a politics of the common good, of what does it look like to embrace and not to see things as a zero-sum game between the different parts of Israeli society. So that's the work on the ground.
I suppose that leads very neatly to what is happening on the ground in Israel today. We've seen again last night massive demonstrations in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, and demonstrations in Caesarea and a number of places. And this has been building, I think, since March, April, from what I can tell, and started off maybe on one track and has now moved. What are these protests now, and how have they changed over the period since they started?
Yeah, so I think we have to be careful. I personally have not been participating in the protests, but my daughter, for example, is, and I always ask her to give me a sociological wrap-up of who's there, like what is actually going on. It's very difficult to see, because almost everyone who is reporting on what's happening has an angle that they're bringing to looking at what's happening. And we know this also from the social protests in 2011. Which were the last massive social protests that existed in Israel. These still haven't gotten to those numbers. Those numbers started swelling to 50,000 at a protest, 100,000 at a protest. Large scale protests, the ones we're looking at today, which are in multiple sites, are in the thousands, like last night's. Again, it's a little hard to figure out the numbers, but 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 in 2-3 different central locations and a number of different locations. But I think that what we're seeing is a little bit of a perfect storm. Right, so at least the match that has lit this, right, is clearly Corona. But this has been churning, and we've said this a lot here and elsewhere, that Corona is not the issue itself, but Corona has exposed fault lines that otherwise have existed. Israel, as we all know, and something that I think Australians can sympathize with on some level, have had political turmoil here for the last year, right? You, I understand, have had premiers at a rapid rate. I was reading recently that there's a Twitter account in Australia that lets people know every half hour who the premier is, who the prime minister is, because it's changed so many times. I was amused by that, because we have, in certain ways, the opposite. That we've had steady prime ministership with Netanyahu, but a growing dissatisfaction, a growing protest among tactics, and particularly, as we all know, the fact that he has been indicted on numerous accounts, and many people feel that he is incapable and no longer legitimate to lead, to be that. And to that. So that has been a big feeder, along with tremendous frustration with the democratic process in Israel in general, the very legitimacy of protests, the way that people, particularly on the center and the center left, have related to this leadership around that. And so, you know, a feeling that the democratic fiber of Israel itself has been challenged by this process, and the stalemate politically that's out there. That's there. And then, of course, that combines with, you know, other pieces of this, which is the economic crisis that we're moving into slowly here. We, like you, I was talking about with this to you, Sharene, beforehand, there's some similarities between what's happened in Israel and what happened particularly in Victoria, in that we had a very successful first run, and it's very interesting in terms of government stability and popularity. Netanyahu's popularity went dramatically up during the first wave, dramatically up, to the frustration of his most vicious critics around that. So much so that I think it seemed as if he was going to be interested in calling another election, because it seemed he would be able to win an absolute majority as a result of that. And a feeling of self-satisfaction in Israel, and a little bit of the Israeli can-do kind of bit, like, we got this, we ran this well. And then what happened is that we ended lockdown, and both the signals from the country, from the government, and the feeling in the population was business as usual. And everyone went back pretty much in extremely breakneck pace to normal life. And now our numbers have been swelling. And the government has been playing around with what to do about that, leading to the tensions that are already there from the lockdown and the economic crisis, the threat of another lockdown going down, the pushback around that, and the exposure to many people and in this case, not just on the center and not just on the left, but also on the right, that the government has done a poor job. And Netanyahu, who was getting 80%, approval ratings in the first wave, is now down, I think, to 40%, and perhaps somewhere in those numbers. I didn't check them around that. So you've got this anxiety that is growing in the society. And then probably the last thing that maybe is the most important and connects to what I was saying about my move from Heschel to Shaharit. And in this way, I think it plays to a lot of places. Certainly, you can hear my American accent. I moved to Israel in 1982, but I'm a big observer of what's been going on in America. And you see there as well, the divides that separate the country have become a central piece of the dysfunctionality of the government. Or to say it differently, without the social cohesion that allows people to feel like that they're in this together, that they trust their leaders, that they trust each other, right? Without that holding things together, then when crisis hits, the divides become more acute. And I think that's a lot what's happening right now, including, as you said in your introduction, including violence that is also broken out on the edges of this, but real violence. Real violence primarily from extreme right-wing organizations to what's perceived of as a center leftist protest, and some strong, which exists on the fringes of Israeli society and not only on the fringes of Israeli society, right? Some harsh racist language and violence that plays itself around delegitimizing whole populations, certainly Arab populations, but also the left in general, right? As seen as traitors, as seen as people not connected, a nativism that goes very deep. The right wing as a whole does not hold that, but on the edges of that, it exists, and the right wing has a difficult time criticizing that, right, in the public conversation, in the same way that the left sometimes has difficulty criticizing its more extreme wings that play themselves out in very different ways. So that's what's happening right now, and you don't know where it's going. There's a lot of activity that's out there, and a lot of unrest. The police is part of it, and these different groups that are playing themselves out, and a bunch of different protests that have sort of come together in one, but have different narratives to them that come together.
And I suppose the last point you made is the one that struck me as I started to kind of do a bit of reading, that in 2011, there was some very notable leaders, people like Stiv Shafir and people who led those protests and really were the spokesman and the voice and the people behind them. Here it seems to be there seems to be no very clear leaders. There's various groups, and I think as time has gone on, the issues that they're there about have kind of expanded from disappointment about the coalition through now economic and a whole lot of things. Is that perception right?
Yeah, I think that perception is right. The only thing that I would say, which is important, two things comparing 2011 to today. So first of all, I think that there's a little bit of a sentiment in what you said. Maybe I misread that, but in any way, it's like, okay, where's the leadership of this? But there is a value to a grassroots, right, movement. A lot of the critiques of this protest, and certainly the 2011, that there were center-left political parties and political interests that were sitting behind it. We know from 2011 that there was much more support. I asked a friend who deals with crunching numbers right before this talk to send me some of the numbers from 2011 so I could refresh myself. And there was passive support among the right and among the center-right for the protests, but nowhere near the levels of support that there were from the center and the left. And we know this also from its political manifestations, right? Two politicians started their career as heads of the social protest. Both Stiv Shafir, that was there, and now our Minister of, I believe, Economics, whose name is escaping me right now in the conversation. But both of them were two of the four major leaders, Daphne Lee from the civil society, and et cetera. And so there was a fear that that's what was happening, that was owned by those groups. And the perception is while it was also very grassroots driven, but the sense that it was more a center-left protest has played itself out, both in the immediate political capital Itzik Shmuley, by the way, is the fellow that his name of what was happening. So, so they emerged from the 2011 protest, and they all came from the center left. So that's where that is. And this protest, it seems like it's coming from similar places in the end, with a smattering of people from other pieces as well, and with a less defined kind of core, a less organized core that gives it a decentralized feeling that's taking place in a number of different localities throughout the country.
So, I mean, there's obviously, as you say, there's been violence on the edges. There's been pretty strong language from Netanyahu and a number of people about what they think of these demonstrators. There seems to be a level of vitriol and something really bubbling there that has the potential to explode. And I did see one commentator who said that he felt there was the same kind of stirrings as there were in February '83 when there was a grenade attack at a Peace Now rally, or just before Rabin was killed. Is that from what you're seeing and reading, is that getting overexcited, or is there something there that you think has a potential, not a good potential?
One should never get overexcited about a sense of violence, right? Those things, and we saw them, whether it's fringe or not fringe. There's still an argument about Yigal Amir and the murder of Rabin, and whether these were fringe elements or how much they were mainstreamed and how much they were given legitimacy. And those are arguments that still play to this day in Israeli society, with the right center seeing it differently than the left center, sees those things. There's no doubt that there's violence that's going place on the fringes. Arrests were made Thursday night and again on Saturday night, including the use of broken bottles that were both thrown at and were actually used to cut people up. Hitting an artery on somebody's neck would lead to a death. So it's not made up. That being said, it's not this massive, wide scale sense of violence or losing control. And the police have been doing, I think, a relatively good job in trying to maintain order in all of this. I think Saturday night's protests in general were more structured by the protesters, and more the police were allowing the protests to go on as that they were supposed to be. And again, they're the police, as we know in other places in the world. It's a very complicated piece as to how to see the police in these pieces. But I think that the point that I want to drive home here is that what we are seeing, I said that Corona and this Corona period, and it's clearly that Corona is what's led to all of these protests taking place, the lockdown, the opening up again, the threat of locking down again. You can't divorce these protests from the context that it's taking place in, right? That they served as a catalyst, they served as the groundwork for it, but Corona allowed that to happen. But in this sense, and which is why I keep on going back to the question also of who the protesters are and where they sit on the right and left, Israel is a divided country, and it's divided politically. And those divisions are getting larger, not smaller. That is to say, the sense of two camps that, by the way, largely are not, right, again, using the American context, are not equally distributed, right? That there's a larger percentage of people in the center right camp and in the right camp than there are in the center left camp. We had 3 elections that did virtually nothing to change that divide. Virtually nothing. It stayed almost hermetically sealed between the sociologies and the political divisions on which the society divides itself. The idea that we are in an ideological debate between different ideas and people are rationally sitting and deciding where they sit does not reflect the reality of people who are committed in their identities to different ways of seeing this world, different views, and that that middle area is emptying out. And as that middle area empties out, the divide becomes greater, and the fears, among other things, about violence, which is the most extreme expression of those divides, but it's the most extreme expression of divides that start much earlier with a sense that we're right and the other side is evil as the basic kind of DNA of what those divides in modern democracies are looking like. And the only way to deal with healing those divides, to crossing those things, is the attempts to understand, right, that it's not we are right and they are evil, but on the core part of what a democratic society is supposed to be about is the fact that we actually share dreams of a future together, and we have different takes on what that is, and being involved as a democratic society in a conversation in many different levels, that's not just talking, but it's also doing, that allows us to connect to each other and feel connection to one another. Without those connections, it is a very slippery slope. And Israel, like other countries, has been on that slippery slope for a very long time. Those are the deep dangers. The danger to democracy in Israel is that. Before any other questions of what we mean by democracy, the loss of people's belief that they can build a common future together and that they feel some sort of companionship, camaraderie, right, fellowship with other citizens. I feel deep camaraderie with my tribe in that. Right? Whether my tribe is religious, ultra-Orthodox, right? Nationalist, that, or whether my tribe is the liberal tribe. I feel deep connection to those, deep connection, but I feel far less connection to those people that are not. Our president, Ruby Rivlin, gave a very famous speech called the Four Tribes speech. We talked about Israeli society being made up of 4 separate tribes. Those 4 separate tribes that have different dreams for what the future is. Politics demands that we find ways to building a common future with deep diversity, with deep different views of how the way the world looks. These protests are another expression of those divides. They are not a coming together across those divides.
And having said that, would you see it that in fact Bibi Netanyahu and members of his government, by some of their statements, had actually tried to use those protests to their advantage to, in some ways, to shore up their own positions?
That's what politicians always do.
True.
It's part of the profession, right? It's part of what they do. Now, there are levels of that, and there are levels of that. The problem is that, again, one side of the debate is less forgiving than those divides than the other side of the debate is. One side hears certain things, the other side hears other things about it. Now, I have my own political take on those divides, right? Yes, I think that if I were to point a finger at what's happened over the last several years in Israeli society, I think that it has become more legitimate, paradoxically, at the same time that this government has done more in legislation to bring funds to Israeli Arabs. At the same time, they've legitimized on a national level, certain levels, low-key, but real incitement to the Arab minority in Israel, right? That is part of the legitimization of a political language that I think is problematic. The difficulty is, so in that sense, yes, right? Less, it's like a bull in a china shop, right? Less sensitivity to those things. By the way, here also, there was a difference between the first wave and the second wave of Corona, right? First wave, when things were going well, when people were coming together, Netanyahu was using a much more inclusive speech about things, right? People were feeling like things were going well. His largest critics were also feeling like, there's some leadership involved, even though there was a deep critique perhaps of how much he was grabbing the stage and how much he was getting political capital for the position he's taken, publicly to be able to get the capital, the political capital, from a successful running of things. But when things started going bad, when things took a downturn, then the language also moves in those directions as well in many ways. And so yes, I'm critical of those things. But I guess one of the things that I'm trying to say here is that the dynamic, in different ways, but it works both ways, right? It's a dynamic that I mean, I've heard in private rooms some very, very violent, language about Netanyahu and about the leadership, about that. I don't think it's going to lead to violence in any sense, but there's this deep sense of delegitimization that takes place on both sides of the aisle. And what I'm saying is that the delegitimization, that is the groundwork that allows for a politics that's very divisive to take place. And both sides are very involved in that. And it's involved in that because we've been in a stalemate also politically for a very long time. And it doesn't seem that those divides are going to end anytime soon.
So if you had a crystal ball, or maybe you do have a crystal ball, where does this go? Are the demonstrations just going to continue to grow? What is the breaker? Is something going to put a breaker on this? How does this play out going forward?
Yeah, you know, any attempts to predict the future by anyone have been usually disastrous in their attempts to predict. So I am not going to predict. I am going to say that there is real unrest out there. There is a pent-up anger, primarily from the center left, that's getting fuel from people who are small shop owners, kind of mid-sized businesses, the feeling, and maybe I should say something about that as well, which is that, you know, Israel has made its name as being startup nation. But I think that there's a phrase that's very helpful, that Israel is both startup nation, but also stagnant nation. And they are also, we have these divides that we're talking about, and these divides are also socioeconomic, right? The highest socioeconomic percentiles of Israeli society, 8th, 9th, and 10th, they've broken down the percentiles 1 through 10. 8, 9, and 10 vote overwhelmingly for the center left, overwhelmingly, right? 6, 5, and 4, and 3 vote overwhelmingly for the Likud, and the low percentages vote Arab and Haredi because of the poverty of both of those communities that are around there. So, the stagnant nation piece of this, and that's one of the dilemmas of Israeli society, usually votes center right, the stagnant nation pieces, and yet they don't join these protests. So on some level, there's a hope that the economic turmoil will bring a larger group of people into the protest movement, hope from the center left around that. And then I think the challenge for these protests is how inclusive can they be? One of the difficulties with the social protests of 2011 that spent a lot of time trying to be inclusive, but we know that the protests that were taking place in particular towns and cities were much more diverse than the ones that were taking place on a national level, right? The ones that were taking place in these different encampments were more diverse than they were taking here. So I think one of the challenges of these protests are going to be, are they going to both, in fact, be able to expand themselves beyond the divide, which will depend on them being able to have a narrative that breaks out of the anti-Netanyahu, anti-right-wing politics of that conversation? And will other people from a larger swath of Israeli society feel at home? Right? I've been at protests over the years because of the work that I do with people that come from the center, people come from the right. Invariably, these protests are dominated by center left and left people, including peace ones, including women's issues ones. And the people that I'm with often leave because they don't feel like that they're at home in these protests. They don't feel like they're part of this, right? And they say, Elon, I can't. And they just leave. So I think that's a big challenge of what happens, and I think the economics of it are a big challenge as to where it's going down. But those are all short-term questions, right? I don't think, if you're going to ask me, do I think these protests are going to lead to new elections? Are they going to lead to Netanyahu resigning? Are they going to, you know? I think we have so much history over the last year or two around these issues that we see it's impenetrable divide politically. Right? In the politics right now, more people, there is a leaving of Netanyahu, and it's going to Naftali Bennett on the right, right? The center left votes are moving from Kachol Lavan, from those that join the coalition, Benny Gantz and the like, to Yair Lapid. And the right-wing ones are going from Netanyahu to Bennett, broadly put. That's what you see. Those are what's growing. So it's not changing the political dynamic, and I don't see that political dynamic changing anytime soon, because it's deep, it's identity driven, and it's real, and it has growing mutual hatred between these two camps and how they see themselves. Sometimes the hatred is mild. Sometimes the hatred is more, right, violent. That's around that, particularly from the right. But that feeling that somehow the other side is the enemy is felt very, very deeply. And again, I'd like to say, not just in Israel. It's a dynamic that we see around the world in democracies that are around that. Shaharit's work, the work that we do, is driven by the idea of how do you cross those divides? How do you create spaces that take seriously each other's side? And is it possible to build different agendas that allow people to come together and not divide, that bring people, you know, united, that can build those things that people from different places can feel at home with one another. So maybe I'll just say, I'll say one thing around that, and then take another couple of questions from you. So I want to say something about the idea, I said fraternity or fellowship or friendship, right? In the Jewish tradition, we have this idea, Kol Yisrael, Arevim Ze Lezeh, we're all connected to one another. The French Revolution had this idea, right? You know, liberté, equalité, fraternité. And a lot has been written that I take very seriously, that our emphases have been too much on liberté and equality and not enough on fraternité. And I would say that in Israel especially, but I think democracy is built on the idea first and foremost that there is a fellowship among citizens, right? That transcends our differences, that transcends our conflicts, that we feel some sense of shared lives together. And that we need to focus, instead of the principled ideas that divide us, we need to create that kind of bondage that allows us to transcend those divides. You know, it happens in families all the time. Around the dinner table, certainly in Israel, you have different people that come from very different, you know, in your average, for example, Shas family that's identified with Mizrahi, ultra-Orthodox. You had in those households people that went in very different directions. Someone went, you know, to the ultra-Orthodox, someone went to a more traditional, someone went secular, and they come together. But mom loves everybody, right? She disagrees with them on some things, but she loves everybody. It's an inclusive household. It's a broad tent. It's one that's based on affections that connect one another to that. And we have seen in practice, we've seen how that can make a difference. We've seen, you know, we have right now in the Knesset, we have a woman who just got elected who's part of the coalition. And we have a woman who got elected, an Arab woman who's part of the opposition. We've got a great little photo of the two of them sitting together in the back benches of the Knesset, both of them wearing face masks on the one hand, and both of them wearing hair coverings on the other hand, right? These two coverings of the head and of their mouths, and these two religious women from different traditions that are often seen as the root of the conflicts, right? If we can't we all just get along? You know, we keep religion out of things. We're all human beings in the end. We're all individuals in the end. No, Israel is rich with identity, right? We have rich identities in this country that come from lots of different places that bring these people together. We don't ask people to leave those things at home. We ask them to bring them together. And the two of them are sitting there together. One of them, the religious woman, who's also a feminist and also religious and also in the coalition. She's been going to the meetings of the Knesset committee that deal with violence against women in the Arab sector. She was the only, you know, woman from the coalition that was there. But she says, these issues are important to me. These issues concern me. The issues that concern me are not simply what happens in my community. The issues that concern me are issues that connect to all the different communities in our country. We just had a board meeting where by Zoom, we have two city council members in the city of Ramla, one Ethiopian and one a woman from Mizrahi background. And the Ethiopian fellow was talking about his work with the Arabs And he said before he was in Shaharit, he never worked particularly with the Arab community, but being in the 120 program, which is our leadership training, right? And spending so many hours building friendships, building comradeship, building fellowship, hearing their story. We don't leave the stories outside, we bring the stories inside, bring people's pain in without demanding immediately that that gets political expression. But first of all, to care about one another as people, as fellow citizens, as people that we share this world, this country with together, has led him to do all this work. He was the head of one of the Matnasim in Ramla. He does this work now with the Arabs that are in the community as well, and reaching out. The Arabs now are in the coalition in Ramla. How do we transcend these differences and understand that we can reach levels of working together that are built on commitments to one another, even if we don't agree about everything, but we can agree about more. And we can also change, right? But that change is in all directions, right? It's not just everybody becoming liberal center leftists, right? It's changing and taking seriously everybody in the picture.
And obviously the work that you are doing on the ground, and I know there's a number of other organizations who are also doing equivalent types of work, is the work that we would all love to see spreading throughout Israeli society, but to date, maybe that is a much longer term project. But you talked a lot about that really this is a demonstration from the centre left. And I mean, I've seen vague reports that some Likud voters and some people have come along because they're fed up with Netanyahu and they really feel there needs to be a change. But you're really suggesting to us that the demographics is mostly a centre left. We've just had, sorry.
No, I just want to be careful about that. We don't know what the demographics are. It's all anecdotal information. It's all driven by people that are trying to tell a narrative about what the protests are in one direction or another. The one thing that I can say fairly convincingly is that we know about the demographic makeup today of the social protests of 2011. That we know about. And that was also an attempt to be inclusive, and in some ways was inclusive. And there were right-wing protesters there. There were center-right protesters there as well. But the overwhelming drive of it was clearly from the center-left. And the political expressions that both immediately after the election and also later on all played themselves out on the center-left of the country in the end of the day. So I believe that there's a similar dynamic that's going on here as well, right? It'll take time to be able to weed it out and to see that. Obviously, there's an interest in everybody to show it as more inclusive than that and to show some Likud, protesters. It's not that hermetically sealed, but it's pretty hermetically sealed.
So I suppose the question was, and I mean, I've had friends in Israel who before the 3 elections, even before election number 1, were going, look, we don't vote anymore because it's just, there's no point. We've given up. Yes, we're left leaning, but it just seems to be pointless. Where these people are on the streets now, the question's got to be, where were they during the elections, or are they really still in reality representing, as you said, the top percentile in the major cities? And so while they're there and they're loud and we can see them, that maybe they weren't there during the elections to the same degree. So are we getting a kind of skewed picture?
Again, it gets to the same question. I'm scared of playing this recording 2 years down the road and say, that guy he got it completely wrong. It all looks different from there. But I think that I can say with quite a bit of safety that no, that I don't think that it's a skewed picture. I think that there's an attempt to present the picture differently than what it is. What it is primarily, not exclusively, primarily a dynamic of center-left, primarily an expression of a divide that exists very deeply, that even if somebody identifies on some level with some of the messages of the protest, the feeling, look, in this conversation, the feeling that it's in the end of the day connected to the center-left prevents people from coming. In the conversation we had in Ramla, which I mentioned the other night on Zoom with our board, so I asked these 2 board members in Ramla, Ramla's a very right-wing town, and I asked them how do they perceive these social protests that are going on? How do the people in Ramla perceive these social protests? Both of these city council members said, I don't know if it's true or not, but I say categorically, right? Everyone in this town thinks that it's a left-wing protest. That's what people think. Whether in fact it's that way, whether it can expand without that, but that's the way that it feels. And again, you can't divide the protests up from these divides that exist in the society. That divide is deep and real. We just had 3 elections with course of a year, right? There was a little bit of moving the pieces around the board, but not much more than that. In the end of the day, time and time again, we see that the divides hold. People vote in fairly good numbers in Israeli society. There's not poor turnout in the elections. People vote, right? But they vote, you know, for the worlds that they divide in. You are not going to be able to change the dynamic that I'm talking about without some deep structural changes that need to take place on the ground level and on the leadership level that presents a different possibility for Israeli society. As long as we keep on presenting this as a zero-sum game, the politics will not move, right? It will only move if we create alternative possibilities. And those alternative possibilities are exactly in the places that allow people to come together, right? You know, in a town, you know, I mentioned Ashdod, in a town like Ashdod, where national politics came in that broke up the status quo. But for you know, tens of years, Shabbat observance in Ashdod went on peacefully. It didn't go on according to, you know, clear values of religion in the town, and didn't keep up with clear values of religion out of this town. It came up with the compromises that real people in real places make with one another. This store in this community open, this one in this community closed, this public transportation going through here, this one will be pseudo-public transportation so as not to upset the ultra-Orthodox population, and it worked. It worked as a structure, and it worked as a calming of those tensions and allowing people in lots of other ways to come together and work together. I mentioned Ramla. The Arab parties in Ramla, which is a very right-wing city, are now part of the coalition. It's something that you can't imagine in other towns, right? You can't imagine, excuse me, in national government that those things take place. But there is a coming together also from the level of people that know each other, people that are connected to one another, people that refuse to allow, right, the symbolic politics to drum into us, this divide between us, and on a day-to-day level, and increasingly on a national level, the possibility that there's an alternative that's out there. When I said about, you know, this woman from the coalition and this woman from the opposition, right? Both religious people sitting together, coming together, talking about what they can do together, what they can bring together, right? Those are the kind of images that we need. In that way, I blame Netanyahu for using politics of divide. He's not the only one that does it. Right? You know, there's a long history of that also from the left when they were in power around those things. I don't want to equate. I don't want to make it a balance. I don't want to check who's more, who's less, who does it. I'm just saying it's a classic political tool, which is divide and conquer. And we need to create alternative possibilities that show us the possibility and the, you know, and the value of, you know, of converging. Right, of fellowship, of what we call the common good, of bringing those things together. Right, so it's not a short term. It's not short term, right? And maybe I'll just say one thing about that. Right, people sometimes say to me, "But Eilon, we don't have the time." Right, you know, there's no time. Right, and what I always say is, well, if 10 years ago we would have decided that this is what needs to be done, we would be in a very different place than we are today. Right? The situation is urgent. And because the situation is urgent, there are no simple and easy solutions. These are deep problems that are threatening the way we engage one another. We need to change those dynamics. We need a different kind of politics.
And how do we get a different kind of politics without different leadership or without, which we haven't managed to get, and I can't say you're giving me a lot of hope for how this actually happens. You've got to give me some hope here.
No, the opposite, I would say. I would say that you would find, and we see it in survey data, and we see it in local politics, and we have inklings of it in a national level, that there is an alternative narrative that's out there. There are mayors that have been elected in Beit Shemesh, in Yerucham, in other places in the country, that their explicit political agenda was, how do I bring together and not divide? As explicit agendas, and they got elected. They are electable. There are grassroots movements throughout the country, not just connected to Shaharit, that are out there that are bringing people together, the most unlikely of partners in all of these places throughout the society, right? That are trying to envision what a society looks like, what a town looks like, what particular practices look like that we do, right? In common, together around that. And as I said, there are members of Knesset that are making their ways, you know, into it. Now, it's a little bit of a two-edged piece, right? Politics will not change until there's a groundswell, right? A popular support for a different kind of politics, right? A different kind of politics that doesn't fall into this natural divide between the right and the left, the good guys and the bad guys, who's in favor of democracy and who's not in favor of democracy, who's in favor of peace and who's not in favor of peace, right? But allows, in fact, a much richer space that connects in all of those areas. You know, we've done some work on peace, and we know, as I said at the very beginning of what I said, that the peace conversation has been stuck for years among a very small sociology. On the ground, you will find these, you know, first seedlings of projects that connect religious with religious Arabs, with religious Jews that are on the ground to try to think about these things. It's a different kind of peace than what the two-state solution normally defined things as, and how they saw it. But there's a lot of work that's being done, and there are a lot of connections on the ground that are taking place around them. Is it a groundswell? No. Is it a real trend? Yes. Does it have political vitality? Yes. Is it making its way slowly into the Knesset? Yes. Right? There's work that needs to be done, but that work is very real. Like we like to say in Shaharit, we're like the holders of hope, right? We sit in a room with, you know, a settler and a leading Israeli Arab voice, and a you know, and an ultra-Orthodox and a liberal from Tel Aviv, and the common ground that is built. It's not just born with it, but it's built through goodwill and through affection and through listening, but also through acting together, is real.
I mean, you're talking about things that Shaharit and other organisations are doing, which have those glimmerings of the coming together that you're talking about. What kind of take up do you get in Shaharit with the work that you're doing? Do people come to you in large numbers? Do you attract a diverse group from throughout Israel, or is this something that's more in certain towns or in large cities?
We are, but again, I think of it as an ecosystem. Shaharit is one piece of this, right? But there's lots of it that's going on throughout Israeli society from lots of different corners, and you can find it in virtually every place in the country, right? You know, we have 20 cities involved in our community organizing, relationship-based community organizing project. That's in Ma'alot Tarshiha, and that's in Ramla, and that's in Rahat, right? And every place in between, we can find those places. And we can find, when you walk into the room, a large, diverse group of people that aren't talking about, it's not encounter groups. It's how do we make this town, this city better for all of us? And how do we work together to make those changes take place, right? So we have these large groups of people. And in Corona, by the way, it was very moving how virtually through Zoom, we were doing organizing, including food distribution to all the different communities, visits with the elderly who had been isolated out. And the communities that we work with knew better than the authorities the mapping of who was where, because we had tentacles in virtually every community in every city in the town. So I have no doubt, you know, we have an ultra-Orthodox project. I was just on the phone with one of the heads of our Haredi project that's there. And we had just had an hour-and-a-half conversation about what's happening in the Haredi community, which is a very particular piece of the Corona story, right? The Haredi story, right? They have the higher numbers. They were blamed in many ways for what was happening. Much of that blame not warranted. Some of that blame perhaps yes warranted, right? It's had a big impact. Internet use in the Haredi community is up 70% as a result of Corona, which is an opening up to the world. How do we take advantage of that? How do we involve, allow those things to happen? So you see trends that are very encouraging. You see trends that, bring together, right? Do those things become hundreds of thousands of people? I would say part of these protests, and this is good news, and definitely in the social protests of 2011, part of those protests are people that understand what I'm just saying right now on the center left, right? The tone, the very idea that the tone of these protests, and maybe I should have said that, the tone of these protests is trying to be inclusive. We can argue about whether they're succeeding in being inclusive or not, how they're being that, but the attempt to be definitely in the social protests of 2011, I think also in these protests shows that people understand that there's a need to be more inclusive, need to find a language that allows people to come together, right? It's not so simple to do that because you come from the world that you come from. It's hard for you to imagine how this sounds from other perspectives, from other worldviews. How do you make it, in fact, inviting? But I think that there's a clear attempt to do that, which is very different than an angry protest that's against other parts of the population. In many ways, it's an angry protest against Netanyahu, but they're trying very hard to do a divide between Netanyahu and the rest of the population. I think that's almost impossible to do. But I think that is part of what this attempt is, which is also a sign, right? Leave that.
Okay. One of the questions that we've been asked is, I mean, the first demonstrations were very much against the coalition and the decision by Gantz to go into coalition. To what degree do you think that coalition decision and the fact that there is clearly tensions between Gantz and Netanyahu, which was, I think, inevitable, but it's playing out more and more that if one says black, the other one says white almost, that is fueling a feeling that this is just out of control and unworkable?
Yeah, I think that in retrospect, although I'm not sure if I was a political operative and advising Gantz, that I'm not sure if I wouldn't have advised the same thing, which I'll say something about in a second. But there's no doubt the dysfunctionality is also that, which of course feeds to what I'm talking about the divide. Here, ostensibly an emergency unity government, there's nothing unity about it, right? It just brought the hatred, instead of it being between the coalition and the opposition, it brought the anger and distrust and the distaste for one another into the coalition itself. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? It certainly doesn't give a strong sense of governance. It doesn't give, what I'm saying, a common good feeling. The idea that a national government would be a healing process, I don't think that it serves that way at all. And therefore, even people that might have been supportive of the idea in principle see that maybe the other tact was better. The problem is that it's not clear to me at all what the alternative, right, was. Right? We had 3 elections. So I would say to everybody at that point, if you support having a 4th election, then support Gantz not going into the coalition. But if you're against having a 4th election, I don't see the idea that you're going to be able to throw Netanyahu out as a reasonable strategy politically. And so once again, it's structurally, right? The divide is not just made up. It's not just goodwill. It sits so deeply within. And yet, Israel is very far along, because of Shaharit and others, to places and initiatives that work in that area that connects things. And it's real and it's powerful. And you see it every day. We have this mix of people, really from all the different political parties, with decent hearts and inclusive perspectives, and making that possible. So I think that that's the great hope. And I think it's a real hope. And that's why we get up in the morning every day, right? That's what it means to make Israel and our democracies better and healthier, and something that we all can be proud of.
Elon, thank you very much. I'll hand over to Bren now to formally thank you, but I think that we've all found it really interesting to hear from someone who's actually on the ground, and also the work of the Shaharit Institute, which is obviously an organisation that we should keep our eyes out for going forward. Bren.
Thank you, Sharene. That was at once depressing, informative, but also possessing the seeds of hope. Elon, thank you for your time and your thoughts this evening. The Shaharit Institute does a lot of good work, and I would encourage you to check out its website, Shaharit, that's shaharit.org.il. Have a little bit of an explore. I think it's worth it. Sharene, thank you for your time this evening. You are, like me, now in ever tighter lockdown here in Victoria, with a curfew that kicked in just as we were starting this conversation. It will be an interesting 6 more weeks for us here in Melbourne. Next week, we'll be speaking with Dr. Eilon Schwartz, who is a former Labor Party Knesset member and a fierce defender of Zionism on many different platforms. Einat's most recent book, as I mentioned earlier, is The War of Return, and that is her 4th book, all of which were on the subject of Zionism. Of course, we'll be sending out more information about that conversation next Sunday in the coming days. In the meantime, stay safe, keep washing those hands, and we will see you next week. Good night, everyone. And we are off Facebook. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. It took me right back to my my undergraduate sociology and the tribes and this and that. Scrambling to think of my old lectures, but that was.
Yeah, although I have to say, I got a little depressed that the message was depressing. I was very much trying to, give the hope story, which there is, right? But I think maybe when the first time you think about this and you realize how ingrained these divides are, but it also divides up to things that you guys know in your politics and what's happening, right? Right. It's not just an Israeli phenomenon.
That's true, but everything over here is much more muted compared to Israel.
I mean, we have discussions about should you be having demonstrations during coronavirus and court actions to stop demonstrations as not being appropriate. And I was watching there might have been masks on, but social distancing was somewhat missing, at least in Jerusalem last night. So.
Yeah, everyone is selective about all of these things. The protesters themselves will be furious about the ultra-Orthodox who are coming together to pray, right? That are around it, which you're with no social distancing, fine. But then it's everybody, it's everybody's, value scale. So they can't understand why going to synagogue is a higher value, but going to protest, that's clearly a higher value, and vice versa. Right, that's exactly the divides. Anyway,
yeah. It's interesting. My academic stuff was on the peace processes generally and conflict and things like that. And of course, when peace processes and what one side believes is justified, that our side did this. If the other side did it, of course, it's outrageous, and they're trying to undermine the peace process and stuff. And we saw that in Northern Ireland. We saw not exact parallels, but we saw the same thing, obviously, with the Israelis and the Palestinians. And what you're saying is exactly the same. It's,
yeah. By the way, if you come from the peace world, look, we have a video from a conference that we did that I bet will interest you. That kind of looks at the peace question in very similar ways as to how I was describing the environmental question. What does it mean to rescue the peace agenda from the progressive leftist sociology? Right? What does that look like?
Good, thank you. I'll definitely have a look. I'm scrambling. My book is due, the manuscript is due on the 1st of September, so I'm hoping that what I find on your website's not too revolutionary. It might put me in for...
Congratulations.
Have a look at it on the 2nd of September.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe while we're on peace, there's 40 odd people still watching through Zoom, and there was a question on Zoom that we didn't get to about peace. Leo asked, and I might add, he put this at 2 minutes to 8, so that's why we didn't get to it. Is exploring the desired common ground between Israel and the Palestinians feasible while Palestinian leaders strongly oppose normalization?
Yeah, it's sort of like what you just said. Is like I think I'm against red lines in general. I'm against everybody's really good at red lines on the other side, right? So one has to be careful about it. Is common good conceivable when people are outside of the normalization? In some principled way, no, it's not possible, right? But I think going back to what I was saying about the peace piece, and I'm scared now about talking about it in fear that I'm going to upset your book. around,
It's all good.
around those ideas.
I've seen it all.
What does the peace conversation look like when religious people from both the Jewish camp and the Arab camp are engaged in the conversation, right? One of the exact reasons why Israelis are suspicious about the peace process, even if they think that Abbas might have been open to it, they say, what does he represent, right? Where does that go? Hamas in that way, to many people, is perceived of as a more authentic, right, voice, right, for that. Now, the next step might be, and they're not interested in peace, and therefore there's no possibility for peace that's around that. But as Rav Fruman, who was the Rav of the rabbi of the settlement of Tekoa, who had dialogue with Hamas leaders. Now, it's crazy to the liberal secular peace camp that was a possibility, but his claim is that this is not a conflict between two different national movements. This is a conflict between two different national movements, completely embedded in religion.
Yeah, well, that's true. But the point is that both, Bernard Lewis once summed up Christianity and Islam in 7 words. He said, "I'm right, you're wrong, go to hell." Right? The religious conflicts within in fact, and this is actually what my book's about, the religious conflicts within the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, they're existential in that each side sees an anathema, a national movement on the land that God gave us, and each side says
for sure.
It's fascinating that he would
for sure. First of all, I'm looking forward to reading the book, so send me a thing, and let me, I'll get the link. But I would say, I'm not saying it makes it easier. I'm just saying that the idea that you can decouple the conflict from those questions, I would say empirically has been proven to be false. That is to say, it hasn't worked. Right? Maybe it still can work. Maybe if we only hold on a little bit more, it will work. But it seems not to work. And I think that there are real democratic reasons why it doesn't work. When you demand for all of the opposition to your secular liberal view of what peace looks like, right, to accept those premises in order to join the camp, when they don't accept those premises around it, you have to allow those premises to be part of the conversation. Right? Rabin famously said, in conversation about, giving back the land of Israel, he said, it's just a hunk of land, right? Yeah. Now,
He didn't get it.
Right? He didn't get it. Just again, forget that he didn't get it normatively. He didn't get it descriptively. Like, you're not going to be able to do a democratic process, where in the end of the day, the people that you live with have to support a peace plan while demanding that everyone to leave the things that are most important to them outside of the room. It just can't happen. Again, descriptively, it's not going to happen. Whether the other possibility is there, I think that it is there, but you can take a little look at the movie and
you're preaching to the choir.
You can tell me what you think.
Look before the 1st of September.
You can tell me what you think.
Elon, thank you so much. Sharene, thank you.
Pleasure.
I won't see you all soon, but hopefully sooner.
Over screens we may.
Yes, indeed. Cheers. Have a great week, and thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.